The Sega Genesis Mini, or the Sega Mega Drive Mini, was recently released, and to make a long story short, it is a wonderful piece of emulation technology, sporting 40 classic Mega Drive video games ranging from the usual Sega fare to third-party classics such as Castlevania Bloodlines, Street Fighter II, Mega Man The Wily Wars, among others. And then there are 2 bonus games included, and no, they're not the likes of Mr. Balls or Curling 2010 as have been the case in past Mega Drive clones, but really new games, such as a fresh new port of the original Darius game, and an updated version of the long-lost Tetris game that was originally intended to be released for Mega Drive once upon a time, but never saw the light of day due to licensing issues, save for a handful of super rare cartridges that somehow leaked through, as well as the occasional emulated ROM. Now, I reviewed this Mega Drive version of Tetris a few years back, and to make a long story short on that count, it's not very good. Controls were rather wonky with some slight delay, the overall presentation and quality was not quite up to the level of the earlier computer ports, and was otherwise a subpar port of Sega's Tetris arcade game, which I've also reviewed many moons ago, and I liked that one a little better. So I was curious about this one most of all, because apparently this is not a straight emulation of the original version, rather an updated conversion that's more in line with not only the original arcade game, but with additional gameplay that's been tweaked to conform to the current Tetris standard, whatever that ends up meaning. I assume this meant 2 rotation buttons and the ability to hard drop your tetrominos into place, features that were not in the original Mega Drive release, or even the Sega arcade game for that matter. Actually, this new Mega Drive port, which is currently exclusive to the Sega Genesis Mini console, and also I assume the Mega Drive equivalent, is nothing at all like the one I've played a couple years back. This one has fewer options, a difficulty select button configuration, and a sound test to go along with the game's single and 2-player modes. The old version had a status meter on the side, as well as an additional mode where occasional flashing pieces would appear and grant extra bonuses if they were used to clear lines away. This new version is a little more scaled back in the feature set, but so long as the gameplay has been cleaned up and we're given a version of Tetris that plays well, then all should be forgiven at least, right? Well, for the purposes of research, I went back to play the old Tetris arcade game from Sega to refresh my memory on how well that game played, and despite the limited control of the era and the lack of wall kick tendencies and rotating pieces, it was a perfectly playable version of Tetris. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Sega Genesis Mini version of Tetris, which retains the rather rubbish response time of the original Mega Drive port. In a way, it's a somewhat more playable version of Tetris, more in line with the NES or Game Boy iterations of the time, with the ability to rotate pieces clockwise or counter, the ability to hard drop pieces into place, and even able to spin along the walls, which you couldn't do in the original release. So someone familiar with modern Tetris can pick this up and not be completely thrown off by the game's control scheme since it's been semi-modernized. Of course, if you want to keep it old school as it were, you can configure the button mapping to match the original release so you only have the one rotate button. But as with the original Mega Drive release, control is hampered by a somewhat inconsistent response time that tends to throw your game off. Sometimes there's a very noticeable lag in response time, while other instances will have pieces careening to the other side without warning. This makes the game a bit more of a struggle to play since it lacks the slick response time that other more popular versions of Tetris at the time or since have come with. It's a shame too, because this is supposed to be a new version made from the ground up, and they could have fixed this control issue. One of the main reasons I bought a Sega Genesis Mini among others was to see if this version of Tetris was fixed compared to the original flawed limited release, and that was clearly, unfortunately, not the case. To the new version's credit, the new port does look more polished, almost in line with the arcade original in terms of the layout, the font, the block appearances, and whatnots. The musical cues and sound effects have also received a bit of an upgrade in quality, almost sounding like the source material without that weird twang of sorts that the original port had. And that's really the truest tragedy of this version of Tetris. It could have been an almost one-to-one recreation of the original Sega Tetris arcade game within the hardware capabilities of the Sega Mega Drive, and this looks and sounds like a dead ringer for that arcade original, with only minute differences to distinguish the two. On the presentation side, the people behind this port did a phenomenal job. I only wish they spent more time fine-tuning the controls so it didn't have the lag, then you would have something truly special on hand here. Overall, Tetris on the Sega Genesis Mini, because let's be honest, that's the only place you're playing this thing on, is not the same game as the original Mega Drive port, which is both a positive and a negative. Positive on account of this being somewhat more polished than the original game, though still not ideal, and also a negative because this is not a long-lost port, but a whole new game based on an old arcade game. Really, you could have just said this includes Tetris, but because there was a long lost version that's only known to a few people, you could use that as an advertising tool and push this as that, even though this isn't really that, it's just a more recent port of an old arcade game. Not that it matters in the long run, because control issues hamper what would otherwise have been a fun but basic Tetris game for the masses. For the sake of curiosity, I'd say give this a shot, but as far as quality Tetris titles on a whole, those could be found almost anywhere else these days. And this news version, as neat of an inclusion as it may be, isn't really anything special and not something that should be a determining factor in your purchasing a Sega Genesis Mini. Yeah, so this thing has Castle of Illusion on it, which I've never played. So that's gonna be fun to check out. It's really a nice little piece of tech, though. I had to get these 6-button controllers that this did not come with. It came with the 3-button controllers, which I've never been a big fan of. Controversy, I'm sure. Um, Now these are all right. They work with this. They work on the PC, and I don't know. Is that too much of a tease for something that may or may not happen? I suppose so. Anyways, moving right along. Later.